Javier Milei is taking a chainsaw to a state that many Argentines now view as the absolute root of all their problems. What we're seeing right now is a radical, totally unprecedented experiment in economic shock therapy. The goal? To systematically dismantle 100 years of statism and drag a country, one that's been plagued by hyperinflation and endless economic crises, all the way back to its 19th century classical liberal roots. And the whole world is watching this explanator of a situation so closely because the immediate validation in the numbers is just wild. Take the abrupt drop in Argentina's monthly inflation. In December 2023, it was running at a staggering 25% in a single month. But fast forward to November 2024, so less than a year later, and that number plummeted to just 2.4%. For decades, the dominant political narrative in Argentina, which was heavily driven by left-wing, Peronist forces, was basically that the state was the fundamental solution to everything. Now, well, listen to Federico Sturzenegger, the current Minister of Deregulation. He recently said, "The state is the reason for all your problems." It's a massive paradigm shift, literally flipping a century of collectivist, state-centric narrative completely upside down. Section 1. The Chainsaw Experiment, Dismantling a Century of Statism. So, to gut a corporatist state that made Argentina one of the most repressed economies globally, that chainsaw metaphor? It's pretty literal. By executing a drastic 30% cut in government spending, the administration achieved the country's very first primary fiscal surplus since 2008. We are talking about incredibly aggressive fiscal austerity here. They are deploying it to forcefully balance the budget and physically stop the vicious cycle of endless sovereign debt that has just haunted the nation for so long. And this austerity is trickling down rapidly into everyday microeconomic reality. Take the housing market, for example. By completely abolishing rent controls, the free market just stepped right in. The supply of available apartments drastically increased, and rental prices in Buenos Aires actually dropped by almost 50%. They also let the PAIS import tax expire, and they entirely eliminated this obsolete trade stamping system that used to just bottleneck foreign merchandise. It's rapid, everyday shock therapy. Section 2. Echoes of the Golden Age, Returning to 1853. Now, this shock therapy isn't some brand new, untested idea. It's actually a deliberate throwback to an era when Argentina was considered a highly prosperous Western Mecca. Their blueprint is classical liberalism. That's a political tradition grounded in property rights, competitive free markets, decentralized governance, and very strict constraints on state power. This core philosophy marks a harsh, unapologetic pivot away from decades of state-planned collectivism, and it pushes the country firmly toward individualism and free enterprise. This connection between past and present is totally intentional. Consider Juan Bautista Alberti, the 19th century jurist who heavily influenced Argentina's 1853 constitution, which, fun fact, was actually inspired by the US Constitution. His core doctrine was to abolish the statist regime. Today, Milei's modern chainsaw mandate to slash taxes and dismantle bureaucracy is philosophically identical. And to really cement this connection, Alberti's face now even graces Argentina's brand new 20,000 peso note. Section 3. The Zero-Emission Shock, Halting the Printers. To really understand how they pulled the brakes on prices, we have to look under the hood at central bank mechanics. In July 2024, the bank implemented a zero-emissions policy. Basically, they put an abrupt, hard stop to the practice of printing pesos just to pay interest on central bank debts. The high volume of money printing that was happening pre-July, it simply vanished. Halting the growth of the monetary base created what some experts are now calling a super peso. By heavily restricting the supply of new money, they stabilized financial exchange rates. The gap between the official and black market exchange rates shrank to just 16%, and the local currency actually strengthened against the US dollar. That is an incredibly rare event in global markets right now. And global markets are absolutely reacting to this. Argentina's country risk index has plummeted from a staggering 3,000 points in 2022 to below 600 today. With bond prices surging over 150%, the international financial community is sending a clear signal: this restrictive monetary shock therapy is actually working. Section 4. The cepo and provinces, the looming hurdles. But despite all these early wins, full economic freedom is definitely still out of reach. And that's largely thanks to the dreaded cepo, or currency clamp. This is a highly complex web of massive capital controls that is still actively hindering the economy. For instance, individuals are limited to buying just 200 savings dollars a month. There's still a heavy 30% tax on dollar transactions and credit cards used abroad. Exporters are forced to repatriate earnings, and roughly $5 billion in foreign corporate dividends are essentially trapped inside the country. Without dismantling this web, full economic freedom remains stalled. Beyond those currency controls, there is deep, deep ideological friction between the federal government and powerful provincial leaders. When it comes to subsoil mining rights and resource revenue, the provinces fiercely guard their constitutional ownership, and they demand localized spending. They strongly oppose the classical liberal ideals of privatizing those rights to surface owners or using offshore funds. So Milei is kind of caught in the middle here, pushing for foreign exchange retention to avoid inflation, but simultaneously trying to avoid a massive constitutional fight with the provinces. And beyond the legislation, there's a massive societal hurdle to overcome. For any of this to actually stick, citizens have to bring their assets out of the shadows. After decades of being forced to hide their incomes from punitive taxes and heavy regulations, rebuilding a baseline of mutual trust between the people and the formal economy is arguably the hardest task of all. This shift in cultural norms toward transparency is exactly why this matters so much for long-term stability. Section 5. Shift or passing phase. Argentina's ultimate test. The current reality is a pretty sharp contrast of results. On one hand, the economy impressively exited recession with nearly 4% growth in the third quarter of 2024. But full monetary stability remains an unfinished project. Even with the dramatic monthly drops we discussed earlier, double-digit annual inflation will likely persist through 2025. And those heavy currency controls we just talked about, they are still very much intact. So we have to ask, is this a permanent shift or just a phase? Does this massive chainsaw-led dismantling of the state represent a true, lasting return to classical liberty and that golden age of 1853, or is it simply just another temporary swing of the pendulum in Argentina's endless historical cycle of crisis and reaction? The whole world is watching to see if the chainsaw will finish the job or run out of gas.